Hey everyone, welcome back to RayCor's Intel Deep Dive, where we sit down with leaders shaping the future of financial services, compliance, and risk. If you don't know me or this is your first time tuning in, I'm Christina Rea, founder and CEO of RayCor Consulting. Through these conversations, I really like to explore real decisions, leadership challenges, and the strategic thinking happening behind the scenes in regulated industry. Since this episode is going to be released during Women's History Month, I really wanted to take the opportunity to highlight strong women who are leading their industry and also actively building the next generation of solutions and institutions that will shape it. I could think of no better guest to feature this month than Michelle Gitlitz, the founder and CEO of Change Agents. Michelle has spent years working in the intersection of financial regulation, law, compliance, and definitely innovation, and she's now built a really cool technology designed to fundamentally rethink how firms are approaching regulatory compliance and risk management. Michelle, you want to take a minute to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much, Christina, and thanks for welcoming me here. And it's such an honor to be here during Women's History Month. Yeah, you gave such a good intro and summary. I'm the founder and CEO of Change Agents Technologies, Inc. We create financial reporting software using AI and automation that takes tasks that generally really bog down and weigh down legal and compliance professionals, such as completing licensing applications and maintaining those licenses through regulatory reporting. And we just make that process a whole lot easier.
That's terrific. We need tools like that. We need anything to make our lives easier in this industry. So thank you, Michelle, so much for taking the time to join us today. For this episode, I really want to talk about something we don't really always talk about openly in our industry, and that's what it takes to really build authority and leadership in a highly regulated environment, especially when you're introducing a new idea into the system, such as Michelle is doing. So Michelle, I want to get into, your transition from, maybe in-house industry expert to founder and leader, and what it looks like to build in an industry that is continuously evolving. So let's dive into that. I would love for you to share some of your story, what motivated your transition into founding your own company and really being a leader, not only with your own company, but for women in the industry. And what's kind of surprised you the most about becoming a founder compared to operating before within established institutions?
Yeah. I think I've always been in regulated financial services. I'm trained as a lawyer. I practiced as a lawyer at two AmLaw 100 law firms and a boutique financial integrity firm. So highly regulated financial services is sort of in my blood. I came to crypto in 2015, a little bit by accident. And I was at a happy hour where I met some secondary market traders in 2015 who were talking about how crypto was going to change regulated financial services. And the terms they were using, Ethereum and Bitcoin and mining, were completely unfamiliar to me. But these people at this happy hour were utterly convinced it was going to change the landscape of central banking. And I was curious. And so I did my own research and I thought crypto was definitely going to make an impact. And in 2015, that wasn't exactly the most popular view when you were working, at a big, large law firm that was servicing a lot of regulated financial companies. But as time passed, I really felt a passion about it. And I felt that this was something I personally wanted to pay attention to and that I wanted to launch the blockchain and crypto practice at that law firm. And so, I was in somewhat of a leadership position at the firm already, which made it a lot easier. But I did take a leap of faith of going to management at the law firm and saying, hey, I really think this is going to be something, that crypto and blockchain are going to be something. They're going to be something that the law firm is going to want to help servicing clients. And so, the motivation was interest, was distinguishing myself and my practice. And I think also having a really receptive audience at a firm that said, yeah, tell us more. We're gonna support you.
That's really incredible. I didn't actually know that about you, so I learned something new today too. Yeah, wow, you're really a trailblazer because I got started getting into this industry around the same time you, 2015. I was working for a reg tech startup, and I really barely knew what that meant. They were talking about, smart data and machine learning, and I'm like, what are you guys talking about? And then they started throwing the term blockchain at me, and I was like, I don't know how to compute this. So good for you for recognizing that early. I think anyone that really, followed those trade winds into crypto and fintech, they really did well by themselves.
Thank you.
Has there been a moment so far where you've realized that now building, change agents and doing this for yourself is the new right path?
Yeah, I think, when you mention working at a reg tech company in 2015, I mean, I think that in and of itself, was very transformative. A lot of people
Mhm,
weren't talking about reg tech and weren't even thinking about how technology could streamline or change or improve, these analog processes. What my experience when I was actually in house at a digital payment processor who was, obtaining money transmitter licenses, who was maintaining the licenses they had, it just felt very broken. It felt like
mhm,
we were taking a lot of data about the company, the control persons, the executive team. We had to use that data to populate forms, for applications. We had to take transaction data and use that data to report quarterly to the regulators. And it was all so analog. And we were paying consultants a lot of money to
mhm.
take the data and then transpose it onto these forms, or we ourselves had to do it. And I just thought to myself, if we can build, crypto wallets, automated market solutions, DeFi protocols, can we really not solve this problem of making financial reporting easier and more streamlined?
Yeah, that is a great pain point to target. Compliance gets a lot of short shrift in the innovation department. I've definitely worked for big companies that had all the money in the world, and we were stuck using broken tools and old processes. And, this is the way it's always been done. So I love having conversations with people, and especially women, that are introducing new ideas. And to that point, how do you think founders can establish credibility when introducing these new ideas into very highly regulated environments?
I think the most important thing is to understand the current process. And you just touched on something I think that's fundamental, which is as large and as well funded as an organization may be, I think legal and compliance professionals are always struggling to get their budget, right? And that
Hmm.
budget goes to the salaries for the people in their department, it goes to their tooling, it goes for their budget on outside spend, whether it be legal or outsourced compliance, or whether it be, transaction monitoring tools. There's a budget. And I think what I really understood from being in house was that whatever I created could not cause friction with that
Hmm.
budget. I could not build a tool that was going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars
Yep.
per year. And the other thing I couldn't do was I couldn't take the processes that are working, while analog are working for
Hmm.
the organization, and completely append them. I had to work within a budget of, maybe two, three, $4,000 a month for software tooling. And I had to understand how to take the current process, whether it's with Excel spreadsheets or Google documents and drives, and translate that into a software platform that could ingest information and automate some of those processes on a relatively low cost basis.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, Compliance officers don't get it. Compliance and legal doesn't get enough credit for how creative we have to be to make this work because we have so many restrictions around what we have to, produce and how we have to show it. for regulators, for bank partners, internally, for auditors. And we're doing this with very constrained budgets. And then, we have to add our own metrics in. We have to show KPIs and, kind of make quantitative things that are very qualitative to us. So, there's a lot of, I love seeing the innovation that's taking place in the compliance space. I mean, the innovation is everywhere in financial services, but, in this space, being able to see that innovation for cost-effective solutions that will really, um, you know, uh, really help the business in ways the business won't understand. It's so important, and it's fascinating. What do you think are some top leadership challenges that are emerging when innovation meets these regulatory expectations? Because there's all this friction around compliance being a blocker for innovation, and I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I don't think it's true either. I actually think it's the flywheel for innovation. I think that, some of the most innovative companies are companies that are regulated and do
Hmm.
have licenses or do have some reporting requirements. And so I think that, the common concern is that potentially AI and automation will actually replace compliance professionals. But in regulated industries, there's always a need for judgment, accountability, oversight. And you write a lot, in your blogs and in your social media posts about the human in the loop model. And
Hmm.
I think the best systems automate repetitive tasks, surface insights, but maintain that human oversight and decision making. And so, this is compliance augmentation, not replacement. And so we're using technology to empower compliance professionals, not to displace them.
That is one of my favorite things to talk about. I've had a lot of conversations. I certainly, for people that are building the AI to assist with these compliance tasks, I know I have some spicy takes, but I agree with you. I mean, one of the BSA pillars is having a human to oversee the program. I don't see that being changed, that AI can now oversee the program. And, I don't want to make things reductive. That's at the highest level. But to your point, yeah, certain tasks are going to be automated and made more efficient. And that's something that we've always seen with advents of all kinds of technology. But I was having this conversation yesterday with an AI company. I said, I think it's going to, force people in the compliance industry to have to start upskilling. Maybe your day to day isn't going to be, these repetitive tasks anymore. But that's a good thing, because if we're really getting to the heart, which everyone loves to talk about, the heart of why we do what we do, for those of us in financial crimes compliance in some form or fashion, we should be focusing more time on actually finding illicit actors and, spotting patterns and doing all the things that we do, having oversight, naturally of the models and the AI. So personally, I think that's a good thing. And, there's definitely conversations around that about who's the ultimate boss. Is it the CEO? Is it the OCC? Is it the IRS, whoever's doing your exams? But yeah, no, I think they're good conversations to be pushing forward, and I agree with you 100%. I don't think anyone's jobs particularly are in danger, but they're going to start looking different. Job roles, job tasks are going to start looking different. But we've always had that. That I don't think that's a problem that's unique to AI. Um, and since we're two women talking about this, and it is Women's History Month, I'd love to hear your perceptions. Have you found expectations or perceptions of leadership being different as a woman operating in this space?
I've always been in financial services, which has been, fairly male dominated. Then
Hmm.
I went into crypto and crypto related financial services. Again, very traditionally male dominated. I think that's the world I've always been in. And so I don't really know of anything different. I've never been in a very female centered work environment. The challenges, I think, are the challenges that you have even when you are working with a female-centered work environment, which is can people trust you? Do people understand, what you're delivering, the value that you're delivering? And are you maintaining expectations?
Hmm.
I think, for female leaders in this space, having strong relationships with other female leaders, I think is really important. Are there times when things happen and I think to myself, would that happen if I was a man? Of course there are. But I think that happens, to a lot of people. And I think sometimes, it doesn't really matter what gender you are. There are occasions when, unfortunate things happen in the workplace. So I think, having strong female leaders who are friends like you, like Jessie Brooks at Ribbit, like Catherine Kirkpatrick Boss, like,
Hmm.
all of these women who are at the forefront of digital transformation, I think is really incredible. I also think about Jane Kordakovsky, who is a champion, against human trafficking. All of these tools that are being built, they help every industry. And it's really just a matter of harnessing the best of the tooling so that the human can do their best job.
Hmm. Those are some really interesting points, and I want to touch on something that you mentioned, at the beginning of your answer to the question, and that was the concept of trust. And that is so critical, regardless of who you are, working in this space. How do you balance innovation with responsibility in industries like ours where trust is so critical, especially people in compliance and legal where trust and your reputation are everything?
Trust is foundational in financial services.
Mhm.
I think to maintain that trust, systems have to include things like human oversight, clear documentation, and auditability. And so, when you're automating workflows, you need to have a clear audit trail. You have to have documentations of the decisions that were made, and you have to have visibility into that underlying data. And I think having clear audit trails, the human oversight, and the documentation, that inherently builds trust because you can say, don't necessarily trust my word or trust the results. You can go back into the system and look for yourself and see how the decision was generated, upon what data, in what manner, what tooling was used.
Yes, preach, girl.
Yeah.
Documenting, audit trail, yes, having all of that evidence, especially as we're coming into this AI world where people don't understand it and it doesn't behave the way static models, of yesteryear did. We have model risk management frameworks and people are trying to, shoehorn AI into them, and some components work and some don't. So we're all figuring it out together. I talk a lot about AI governance. I won't get into that in this session, but I couldn't agree. And I say it all the time when I speak, documenting, evidencing, even if you're slammed for time, open up a quick Google Doc and just jot down your logic for how you do things. It will take you a long way, especially in the future when you're being questioned about things that should be automated and maybe you needed to make, an off the cuff analog or manual decision because something broke. Trust and reputation is really everything in any highly regulated industry, but especially something with such scrutiny as financial services, and those of us that are always walking the tightrope between trying to, push forward innovation while we're dealing with the legal and compliance end and making sure that, risks are controlled and accounted for. Yeah. So turning the focus a little bit, I'd love to hear your take on what risks you think founders need to be willing to take today that maybe didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. We're talking about getting into crypto 10 years ago. What's kind of changed in the landscape for people that are going off and doing their own thing?
I think fundamentally, you need to have a willingness to experiment. I think testing new ideas, testing them quickly, iterating rapidly, and shipping product or even shipping ideas. If you're a founder ultimately, I think, needs to be able to take the risk. And I think technology is moving so quickly that if you're not willing to put the code out there or not willing to even put the thought out there, right, with this podcast series that you have, right? The first one is always the hardest. The first piece of code you ship is always the hardest. And I think once that code is out there and you have users that are testing it, you have listeners to your podcast, you have people commenting on your social media posts, it becomes easier for you because then you start to get the feedback. We build a lot. We try to build as quickly as we can, but we also build intentionally. At some point, we have to say the product's ready to ship. The product's ready to ship, we're still expecting feedback from the market. And that feedback is really important because we may need to tweak something. We may need to add a different functionality. But if we don't push the product, I would say nothing's ever going to be perfect. Everything needs to be improved. But you can't really know the answers to what needs to be improved unless you put the code out there.
I love that. I love that so much. It makes me think, I read somewhere, somebody told me a piece of advice, especially for founders and people building something new. If you're afraid, you're afraid of failure, you're afraid of rejection, do it anyway. You're never going to not be anxious or nervous or have some fear. And that's healthy to have a little bit. But what's going to get you through that, to build the confidence, to build something great and successful, is you have to do it anyway, even when you're afraid. And that applies to everything, whether you're building a new AI tool, whether you're, preparing to, prepping to run a marathon, a little bit of fear goes a long way, but you got to go through the mud. I say that as somebody who's also a builder in the space. I am constantly freaking out about stuff. I get a lot of people pointing out to me, oh, you seem so confident. I'm like, I run anxiety and cappuccinos most of the time. But you do it anyway. You show up, you get in the arena, you put your ideas and your thoughts and your products out there, and then you learn. We're all making mistakes. Even the biggest financial companies, even the coolest products out there, don't come without bugs and mistakes. People are always talking about ChatGPT having bugs and it gets things wrong. But we're still using it. So, if ChatGPT can screw things up and get citations wrong and have bugs all the time, you can start a podcast series, you can start a product, and it's probably going to ultimately be better and more correct than ChatGPT anyway.
For sure.
This is a great conversation. We're definitely going to have you back at some point to talk about this stuff, more. But as we wrap up the show, what gives you optimism about where the industry is heading? Where financial services, compliance, risk, whatever you want to talk about. These are definitely areas that are not always talked about, in the most positive light. But I'd love to hear a positive take from you about where things are heading.
Yeah, I think what gives me a lot of optimism is the concept that compliance is a strategic advantage. We are often viewed as a cost center. But I think increasingly companies recognize that strong compliance programs enable growth. We see companies getting, federal OCC charters. We see new entrants getting state money transmitter licenses, being registered as broker dealers and registering, for CFTC regulated products. These companies are only able to obtain the charters, the licenses, the registration, because they recognize that they have to have the strong compliance program to enable that growth. And so when companies invest in compliance infrastructure, whether it be with people, with technology, they ultimately build trust with regulators, they can unlock new markets, and they create a more durable business. And I think that shift makes me very optimistic about the future of financial services and innovation. And for someone who got into crypto in 2015, with the theory that this was going to completely be outside of the regulated, financial market ecosystem, to now see partnerships between DeFi protocols and TradFi, to see the proliferation of stable coins enabling, 24/7, 365 remittances. the industry is heading in a very, very important place, leveraged by, I think, really strong legal and compliance professionals.
I think that is a great note to end on. A little bit of optimism, a little bit of kudos to those working so hard and tirelessly in compliance and risk and legal. Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and share your perspective and your experience building in the space. If people would like to reach out to you to introduce themselves or learn more about change agents, what are the best ways to get in touch?
Yeah, best way is to go to www.changeagents.co. And you can also reach me at Michelle at changeagents.co. We'd love to hear from you. You can, connect with me on LinkedIn, DM me. Want to thank you so much, Christina. This is such a wonderful program. It's wonderful to be here with you. You've been a friend. I've admired you, for many years, and just really privileged and thankful to be here.
Well, the feelings are definitely mutual, Michelle. I'm so glad that you were our woman to feature for this month's deep dive. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening to the RayCor Intel Deep Dive. You can find this episode and future conversations on LinkedIn, on YouTube channel. Reach out to me, Christina Rea, REA, on LinkedIn. Check us out, RayCor Consulting on YouTube. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe. Please share with colleagues who are thinking about the future of our industry. Until next time, thank you, everybody, for listening, and happy Women's History Month.